Kentucky, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, thank you so much for being on the show. It's good to see you, sir.
Good morning, Mika. Glad to be with you.
Good morning. All right, so let's talk about what we just heard Senator Schumer saying. He says that it doesn't pass the laugh test if you don't look at those Bush tax cuts and deal with that, too, when you're talking about balancing the budget and moving forward responsibly and spreading the pain. What do you say?
Well, you know, I thought the interesting thing first about the two votes yesterday is that the House Republican proposal actually did better in the Democratic Senate than the Democratic Senate proposal. What I think that tells you is that there is a bipartisan desire to get our annual discretionary budget on a downward trend. With regard to what Senator Schumer said about entitlement reform, I have for 2 years been trying to get the president to the table on that. There will be no entitlement reform without the President of the United States. That is an area where you need a result, not an issue. And I think there's been a curious kind of reluctance, which the Washington Post has noted repeatedly. I'm reminded, for example, of Ruth Marcus's column last week about Where's Waldo, basically criticizing the president for being so passive and sitting on the sidelines. I, too, think we need to do entitlement reform, but we need to do it with the leadership and involvement of the President of the United States.
So you note a reluctance on the part of the President. What about you, sir? Is there reluctance from you, from members of your party, when it comes to dealing with the Bush tax cuts and maybe spreading the pain?
Well,
How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I don't think we have a problem in this country because we tax too little. I think it's because we spend too much. And I think it's clear, given the election last November, we'll not be raising taxes. So the question is, can we get our spending under control? We're spending too much, borrowing too much. Mika, we've added $3 trillion to the national debt just in the last 2 years. You know, our cumulative debt now is $14 trillion, which is the size of our economy. We begin to look a lot like Greece. And by the way, that doesn't even take into account the over $50 trillion in promises we've made to future generations, the entitlements, very popular. But the only way you can do entitlement reform is with the leadership and signature of the President of the United States.
Senator McConnell, 88% of the budget in terms of the problem, it lies both in terms of entitlements. We're talking about, of course, defense spending. So, of course, as a fiscal conservative, you would want to cut defense spending. Is that fair to say?
I think everything is on the table. What's before us at the moment is the domestic discretionary spending reductions. And if you focus on that first step, it is noteworthy that the House Republican spending reduction proposal did better in the Democratic Senate than the Democratic alternative. So what I think that tells you is a bipartisan desire to start down this path. I agree with Chuck Schumer. We need to do entitlement reform, but we can't do that without the president's complicity, involvement, and signature.
But it would help me along the way, and once again, I'm a business guy, so if we were sitting at a table, I would say, Senator, let's make a move. I'll come out loud and say we've got to have entitlement reform, but I want to hear out of your mouth, not first things first, but yeah, we're going to have to look at that defense budget. We're going to have to look at Afghanistan. Why won't you commit to saying that instead of saying everything's on the table?
I'll commit to saying we shouldn't right now with regard to, we've got 2 wars going on at one time. I mean, we have to have a sense of priorities here, and we have 2 wars going on at the same time. We're winding down in Iraq. Hopefully, we will not have a long-term commitment in Afghanistan at this level. And defense spending, as Secretary Gates has pointed out, he wants us to get $100 billion out of defense. We're open to defense reductions. But at the moment, we need to focus on the domestic discretionary side and try to encourage the president. He doesn't have to do it publicly. I'm not asking him to unilaterally take a position on entitlement reform. We're now having plenty of conversations, which I didn't have with them the first 2 years because they had big majorities in the House and Senate. We've had plenty of conversations. We're just not getting anywhere. That's the problem.
Senator, speaking of not getting anywhere, you mentioned the word bipartisanship a few minutes ago. We hear it on both sides of the aisle in Washington, yet each side consistently comes up about 10 yards short of the goal line when it comes to discussing what to cut and when to cut. Could you give us, in the sense of bipartisanship and in the sense of both sides always coming up 10 yards short of the goal line, a timetable for when you're going to get together and cross the goal line? A timetable.
Well, let me tell you what we need to do. We need to come together like Reagan and Tip O'Neill when they fixed Social Security in '83, like Reagan and Tip O'Neill when they did tax reform in '86, like Bill Clinton and the Republicans did welfare reform in '96, and Bill Clinton and the Republicans actually balanced the budget. Anybody remember that? In the late '90s. The opportunity is here, and it is now. Divided government is actually the only time you can do really tough stuff. Republicans are ready. I've got a lot of new members who came here to do difficult, important things, to cut spending and debt. John Boehner has even more. We're waiting for the President of the United States. He is the most prominent Democrat in America. Only his signature can make something a law. Now is the time to engage, and he has been curiously passive to this point.
Pat Buchanan.
Yeah. Senator, the Republicans, and they consider it rightly a pretty bold move. They got about $60 billion they want to take out of this year's budget. I think that's about, what, 1.5% or something like that of the budget. And you get total resistance from the Senate and from the President on 1.5%. What does that lead you to hope for in terms of going after these giant but much more sacrosanct programs like Medicare and Medicaid down the road? I mean, are we going to make these cuts, or are we really headed for the cliff?
Well, it depends on the president. Only he can make a law. Only he can sign something into law, and he has to be engaged in the process. And Pat, I've just given you some examples of presidential leadership in divided government by both a Republican president and a Democratic president. The time to do this is now. Curiously enough, I don't understand why the White House doesn't seem to think this would actually be popular for the president. You know, when he did the tax deal that the vice president and I negotiated back in December, his numbers actually went up. His approval rating went up. It's kind of tracked down since then because he has not been reaching out to us and doing the things the American people think we need to do to get this country's financial house in order.
Willie.
Senator, one quick question on another topic. I want to ask you about Libya. Some of your colleagues in the Senate have called for a no-fly zone, namely John McCain, your colleague there. You, when asked, said you didn't say you were for it. You said you wouldn't rule it out. Where do you stand right now? Do you think a no-fly zone would be a good idea, led by the United States over Libya?
Well, I think as far as I'm willing to go right now is I think short of putting American troops on the ground there, we need to look at all of these options. I think everybody agrees that anything we can do to speed the exit of Muammar Gaddafi would be a good thing. You know, during the Cold War, we would arm insurgents. We did it in a number of different places. Sometimes it was actually very effective. I think there are a number of different options the administration's looking at and that we're encouraging. Some of the Democrats in the Senate think a no-fly zone would be a good idea, too. They would just like to have it done on a multilateral basis. So I think we need to look at all of these options to see if we can be helpful without direct involvement in what could end up being, it seems to be, a civil war in Libya.
Well, Senator, just quickly, Gaddafi looks like he's getting the upper hand again here now, bombing rebel-held towns. Is there a tipping point for you where you would say the United States has to step in? We can't stand by and watch this anymore.
No, we're going to continue to follow it. It's an important development. Of course, all that's been happening in the Middle East the last few months is extremely important. Our ability to impact most of this is quite marginal. We might be able to be helpful in Libya. We're looking at all the options.
All right, Senator, before you go, on the budget, you've accused the president of being reluctant, of punting. Some of members of your party have used that word, of not leading on this. Hasn't this been your party's platform? Hasn't this been your party's message? Why don't you lead on it and put some real options on the table, real numbers, real cuts across the board?
Because I'm not the president of the United States. We elect a president to lead. That's his job. I'm sure he'd rather have the kind of Congress he had the last Congress, but he doesn't. He's got a different Congress now. And the good news about that, from his point of view, if he really wanted to tackle big, difficult, seemingly impossible to solve problems, divided government is the time to do it. And what I'm saying to him, both publicly and privately, is that we're ready to go. But he needs to take the lead.
Isn't that punting too?
No, we only have one president at a time.
Okay.
And he's the president. He won the election. We honor that result. And for the next 2 years, we have to work together if we're going to get anything important done.
Senator Mitch McConnell, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. Great to see you. Come back when Joe's back.
Thank you.
All right, up next, new weekly job numbers out. Business Before the Bell with Aaron Burnett when we come back.